Hello, my name is Jasmina Cibic. I'm a Slovenian London-based artist, and I am delighted to be here with you today. Very sorry I am not there in person, but I have prepared a little presentation on my work where I focused on specifically what I think is the best usage for all of you in this seminar. I think it's a fantastic theme. Very pertinent questions are being raised, and I wanted to expand and discuss the potential of especially creative tools that can expose the hidden mechanisms that the seminar is addressing. So effectively, I think all of us share this drive in trying to reimagine new environments and rewrite and cross-fertilize historical ready-mades for more sustained and critically engaged futures. So the core of my work is really the tracing of archival debris of past ideologies. So this is why I mentioned these historical ready-mades, as I term them, which I then cross-pollinate with similar desire-building structures. So I draw parallels between cultural production and political spectacle, effectively. But I always use a feminist lens. So I'm really looking for the past potential realities, new modes of exchange and politics. So a comment on a title. This actually stems from a Facebook comment by a dear colleague who, in my opinion, is one of the best voices in understanding the predicament or the kind of the frisson that are put between East and West and this geopolitical turn that keeps following our production like bad breath, really. So I wanted to turn this gaze that builds desire of the imperative of exceptionality and attempt to build resilience in using our own cultural capital in creating new pathways for critical thought and reinvention of institutional critique, which is very, very pertinent, I think, in this moment of time. So I want to guide you through a selection of projects that channels directly into the set of relations between architecture and knowledge, and which explore how art and architecture are used to service the ideological ambitions of the state through enacted exercise in the dissection of statecraft. So effectively, I will be drawing primarily archive sources, reconfiguring political rhetoric and ideologically tainted architectural spaces to kind of explain the modes of production of the practice. So just to start very kind of in ancient Rome, these are very old projects which we worked on with a group of 3 other female artists whilst we were students in Venice. And this was a project called Passaporta, which was effectively a performative practice within spaces that related to crossing of borders. So the year is 2000 to 2002. These were the last projects. So just before the whole Schengen enlargement and, still this kind of space, this European space of borders, especially between Slovenia and Italy, which is kind of, very much similar to how it's looking today. So I thought it's an interesting practice to kind of go back to. So the idea here really was to question the role of the artist. Is the artist a gatekeeper, sort of keeping the audience or the user away from an experience, or is the artist an experience provider with giving access? So we were staging these fictitious bureaucratical procedures on board trains while they were passing through borders, inside galleries where visitors had to leave all their personal data in exchange for hygiene kits, because we were quite interested in this idea of hygiene as well as this kind of concept imposed from the West to the East. So Passaporta really brought me to future works which related again with spaces of control. So this was a segment of my practice which actually looked at airports. So I was looking at architecture that had very coded use value. And furthermore, the spectators, when entering these spaces, or let's say the users of the space, they know exactly what authority is in operation, how to oblige the rules of the game of that authority. So I worked with the State Police Orchestra of Slovenia, and I did the first projects, the first performances when Janez Janša, who was then the first time Prime Minister and is again on board today, when he started changing the ideas behind Slovenian national emblems, titles of anthems. So it was a bit of a joke that kind of came from this sort of kind of more right-centered government. So the title was, of course, I Feel Love, because Slovenia has love in its name. And this kind of unofficial slogan somehow became kind of quite a kind of big part of this kind of permutation, how the state kind of like stops its caregiving and kind of obliges its citizens to start walking a very different path, or actually the negative of what the state apparatus itself was dictating. So then this project with the police, we reenacted it not only within the airport, but also inside the Museum of Contemporary Art in Ljubljana. So they performed I Feel Love, which is of course the Donna Summer, Georgia Moroder song. But the idea was that they really created a looped sculpture, which functioned amazingly well within the airport, which is what kind of really got me thinking about the systems of control and how sometimes art institutions are actually much more static and its spectators much more frigid than the actual users of even the most authoritarian space, like an airport. So the audiences within the airport were very playful, really engaging, with a piece. Whereas the art audiences, when brought into the airport to observe this performance, kind of didn't know what to do with themselves. So I guess I'm interested in art and architecture as methods that are used by nation states throughout history to reaffirm the scenography of the spectacle of state, so statecraft. And the architectures and artworks that my practice always references always have one thing in common. So they've all been protecting, presenting, representing, and framing the authority of their client, a nation state. And they're also all cases of architecture and generally culture that has always performed as a site for political action and as a tool for expression of political thought. So mostly they're buildings, events, artworks, and texts that choreograph acts and interactions. And by their articulation as an isolated element, which I then suspend between scenography, prop, and object, they can, or I presume, or announce that they could perhaps dissect the rituals of the spectacle of state. The next project I wanted to kind of briefly go through was my project for the Slovenian Pavilion in Venice Biennial, where kind of architecture and nation state really kind of met in a really lovely way. So I was kind of playing this double-edged game, let's say, of representation and whether it is still possible to represent a nation state. But of course, projects like this have been done in questioning this, but what I really wanted to do is kind of focus really on the architecture. And I was reformulating architecture that has been used by state power throughout history of Slovenia. And not only architecture, but also I used all possible icons I could find, successful and unsuccessful national icons that Slovenia has in its past kind of re-attempted to encircle itself with. So this was the collection of paintings, which you see on the walls. So this is the best, really, it is an amazing collection of Slovenian painters that is actually owned and exhibited on the walls. So it's a live collection inside the Slovenian parliament. So these are paintings that effectively hang behind the backs of politicians. And these paintings were hung in a performance on top of a million Hitler bugs. So what you see here as this kind of very, let's say, ornamental, or almost like an ornamental rash of a wallpaper, is effectively a repeat of these bugs, which are images as proposed by scientific illustrators with whom I worked with, of beetles that are endemic to Slovenia. They only live in 5 caves. They're most numerous in a cave called Hell. They're named after Hitler. So the bug was discovered in 1937. A Nazi sympathizer called Oskar Schimmer gave it a name. And paradoxically, because of collectors of neo-Nazi memorabilia, they are now being hunted into their extinction, almost solely because of its name. And anyhow, so this meeting of the two, of this sort of, this kind of ornamental rash of ideology, as I kind of lovingly called it, and these sort of, best Slovenian artworks that otherwise this is where they hang in the parliament. This kind of frisson, I kind of wanted to not only kind of create a project that was debating soft power mechanisms of individual states, except especially the lack of the soft power mechanisms within Eastern Europe, of the realization of the value of culture, but also really the kind of the potential relationship for kind of further action. So the top left, for example, is the room of the cabinet of the President of National Assembly. The bottom left one is one of my favorites, is the post office of the Parliament, where the people working there were just tired of changing the photograph of the president. So they just hung some flowers and they were saying to us, oh, it's great, we never have to change them. So this idea that these are all still lives is also quite pertinent, because these were the artworks that were never really changed. So no subsequent sort of government was kind of finding them obtrusive to the political taste. So the pavilion also had a segment of video work. So this was the first time I started using film to kind of introduce these narratives that otherwise were kind of quite complex and not necessarily that cryptic, because the projects I create are really not thought of as didactic exercises, although we do have always publications for them. But somehow it still felt that I really wanted to kind of expose the form itself. So not only kind of create things that might be interesting because of solely what they're referencing, but really kind of open up the transcripts, debates, archives. So this was a film shot within the Parliament, which paradoxically today it would not be possible to do this. And it's a reenaction of a debate from 1953. I tried to integrate where a committee, which was kind of held in the same constellation until a few years ago, was debating which artist is representational enough to represent the country in the newly built People's Assembly. So I'm just going to jump forward a little bit. I started using archives a lot, solely because I was finding it really problematic of how, especially sort of going back to architecture, this kind of Yugoslav modernist architecture and art was being kind of rejigged, reformulated within the Western discourse without really speaking of its essence and what it was there to announce or camouflage. So we all know that, actually I'll jump forward a little bit. We all know what the MoMA exhibition did, which was kind of quite phenomenal and kind of had to happen. So for those of you who don't know, the exhibition was called Concrete Utopias, and this was the MoMA exhibition on Yugoslav modernism in 2018. But what really kind of got me thinking so much was this distinction. So on the left, you see the image of the monument, which was one of the kind of anti-fascist struggle monuments in former Yugoslavia, which was photographed by the photographer for the MoMA exhibition especially. And on the right-hand side, it's the same monument as photographed for tourist brochures of the kind of newly revamped tours of the region. And what I found really phenomenal is how this kidnapping of a context happens using solely light weather conditions, or I call them lovingly apocalyptic weather conditions, which I was told so many times that are necessary to observe properly the spomenics of former Yugoslavia. So I found this kind of quite interesting. And just going back, so this is what I was kind of then really struggling to kind of get through to. So the actual archives of their build. So what they were really channeling in their inaction and when they're acting out. And what is again really quite interesting is that so Yugoslav government began building the monuments specifically after the uprise of populism in the 60s, or nationalism better. So until then, Yugoslavia was still trying to kind of promote itself abroad. It was kind of channeling loads of money into world expositions and so on. But in the 60s, with this rise of nationalism, Yugoslavia kind of figures out that actually it needs to really spend time and money at home. So they begin building the monuments to just basically remind people of, the plight of South Slavs and the anti-fascist struggle and fight. So it's really kind of this really interesting kind of repurposing, of funds, which is effectively kind of happening also now within the kind of failures of the European Union. So I always think Yugoslavia is an amazing case study, especially in its relationship between politics and culture, of how much power can be ascribed to this scenographic backdrop effectively. And to just kind of go closer to the maybe more sort of universal questioning, this is another case study from the archives of the United Nations in Geneva. So it's just a little visual story of the choosing of the Soviet gift to the United Nations. So United Nations are effectively built from, so the building itself, its interiors, its sculptures, artworks are all built from, composed from gifts by member states. So when I was researching one of the latest films, I found these amazing images, which were then debated by the curatorial, well, not even curatorial, so it was basically diplomats were kind of debating them. So the Soviets effectively first kind of presented or wanted to donate very, very, socialist realist cosmonauts, of course. And then this idea slowly got more and more abstract until it became a complete abstraction that was most in line with what the UN thought would be the correct political style, especially because of that timing of the American space accident as well. So they were kind of like trying to kind of heal grievances through, again, political styling of the gifts. Another project that I thought is interesting to bring out is Spielraum, which was a 3-chapter film and exhibition project that delved into the instrumentalization of visual language, rhetoric, architecture in the construction of status spectacle. So the title is drawn from Karl Kraus, who was an Austrian writer and a colleague of Adolf Loos. So how Loos was arguing against decoration in architecture, Kraus was arguing against decoration also in language. So I built a project which was created from 3 parts, 3 chapters if you want. It was actually focusing on the birth, on the running room, and on the death of a fictitious, or let's say of a new aesthetic space that is to announce a new ideology. And it also, all the visuals, the entirety of the kind of visual sector and sort of also audio was created from these plans that you see here, which were plans for the city of Belgrade during the first conference of the non-aligned in 61, which you saw an image of heads of state a little bit before. So this was this really amazing sort of announcement of this third way. And this was also a moment in time when Yugoslavia really had to kind of basically tabula rasa moment, it kind of had to like reassign a new aesthetic space that had to break with Soviet Russia, had to break it with the West. And this kind of basically kind of pre-war modernism kind of took kind of a new reinvention. None of this was realized due to extreme lack of funding, of course. The only thing really, well, one of the few things, there were some projects that were, but not from the kind of more monumental government endorsed representation architecture, apart from the Palace of Federation, which I'll come later to. But this is one of them that was, I mean, this is kind of the sad story of history. So this was the Museum of Revolution, and all that was built, so you see on the left, the plan, and on the right, what was actually built. It was just the pillars. And what was really, really sad, or is still sad, is that actually under these pillars, there were like loads of homeless and sometimes even families sleeping. So this whole kind of potential for this amazingness of this, like, flag bearers, of water fountain, fire fountains, this whole kind of new look of the city. This was kind of somehow, this kind of potential became the aesthetic language, the alphabet of my Spielraum. So Spielraum effectively, sorry to go back to this, but Spielraum effectively is this word, which is very slippery in translation. It kind of means margin, but it also means the room to play. So it's kind of this critical space for culture. At least this is my proposition for it. It's the wiggle room between the border, between the authoritarian sort of stop and this kind of creative potential. So this was again a series of films, exhibitions with Ludwig Museum Budapest, Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade, it was the International Graphic Center in Ljubljana as well. And so the first chapter announced its birth, as I said. So the idea was that it's when this new language is birthed, how this alphabet is constructed. Then there was this middle room, or the play, where the entirety of the game is, or the rules, are only known to the people who are enacting it. And then the last part was looking at the death. So what happens with this language when the ideology that summoned it or its client collapses? And of course, this is the former Palace of Federation in Belgrade. And this is effectively a time capsule. So this was a building which was made for this first conference of the non-aligned. And what I really wanted to do is bring in sort of universal, more global sort of debates on tearing down, tearing down buildings that are no longer fit for purpose because of this unassuming ideological exchange. So the game I did here was that I, though, replaced all of the sort of subjecting. So all the, of course, all the quotes that are used in the film are done by men. So I kind of took back in the position of 4 women who represent a pragmatist, a nation builder, a conservationist, and an architect/architect. That kind of re-announce these words. It's kind of like a kind of revenge of the kind of on the power of verticals, if you want. There's an amazing publication which we did with Baltic and Distance that has incredible essays by Lina Đulerović, Jelena Vesić, VHV, Jane Rendell, Dubravka Sekulić, on this kind of progressive force of these archives and these kind of potentials. After Spielraum, I wanted to look further into the notion of, or the relation between the female body and nation state via the architecture representation. So how architecture is used to kind of create desire, similar way to how the female body was always kind of employed at this kind of duality between the temptress and the mother nation. So as I am a bit obsessed with expos, I wanted to look at the kind of the startups of these world expositions. And this is a really interesting case study. So Barcelona, 1929, the Spanish king was losing loads of power. He decided to spend loads of money to reignite the entire city. And of course, this is the project which is mostly known for the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe, also called, Barcelona Pavilion. In fact, it was a German pavilion, which kind of announced the aesthetic for the entirety of the 20th century. But then I found in the archives this little note on this little tiny red circled pavilion, which kind of completely disappeared from archives. And this was the pavilion of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. It's a North photo. It had an amazing location. So it was right next to the palace. And the brief for the architect was a traditional Serbian peasant house. And this is what he came up with. And of course, when I saw this was just really fantastically, superbly amazing as a kind of metaphor for these notions of camouflaging, of concealing, revealing, aesthetic strategies. That you have this avant-garde formulation, which is absolutely incredible. And of course, its interior is extremely classical, if not kitsch. You have rugs, you have lace, you have just this kind of national production. So what was happening at these expos, you're always going to have these, frontal facades that are kind of intended for, the viewers kind of, or don't have the access or can't be bothered to enter. And the interiors are made for the governing elite. So you're going to have this complete schism between the skin and the interior, between the form and the content. So this is what I really wanted to work with. And in front of the pavilion, you see this sort of, I call it the obligatory female nude. And of course, at that point, all the pavilions had their mother nation, that was sort of, the land of plenty, as kind of it's allegorical supporter or just another realization of the same sort of basically brief to what architecture was doing. So I had a little summary of all these mother nations to just see where they are deposited. So we go from Finlandia to Mother Russia to Britannia, Germania, the drill, right? So there's very few countries that don't actually have a mother nation. And of course, Expo is also a great example of national competition of states by architectural innovations. And this idea of architecture as a personification of state is really what is happening here as well with this figure of the mother nation and how the female body can represent the state. And based on this, but also on kind of pure formal level, I, of course, thought of the Adolf Loos project for Josephine Baker's house in Vienna. So this is the same year, we're talking about 1928-29. So it's the same design tactic. And strangely, it's also a design tactic which is purposefully, kind of working on, enhancing visibility. So it's actually just like a visual optical sort of trick to make it more visible. And this was, of course, non-realized, but also they kind of shared, both the pavilion and the house for Josephine Baker shared this notion of a tower of control. So Laws designed a pool for Josephine, where she was supposedly swimming naked. She was overlooked by men sitting and drinking coffee in kind of like a bar on the upper level. And then, oh yeah, and there should be light coming in from the top roof that should shine into her face so she wouldn't see who is looking at her. So as Brashovan frames a nation state, Laws frames an exotic dancer. And what then I did is I kind of brought together all these sort of design tactics, including also another one, which is the razzle dazzle camouflage, which you see on the left, which is by the artist Norman Wilkinson. And this is First World War British naval fleet. So we kind of had the same design tactic that kind of, worked on three notes of sort of creating, basically building design, making something look and feel incredibly powerful. Either it's a female body, a nation state, or a military fleet. And because this pavilion was extremely lacking, I kind of then joined all three designs to kind of recreate this model of the pavilion, of Brashovan's pavilion. And after this, I wanted to return back to the notion of modernism as a political tool. So this was a project called NADA that brought three different architects, male architects who worked for nation state, were summoned by different nation states in different moments of European crises. And in all three cases, modernism was used as an extreme political tool for nation building. So the architects I addressed were Wenceslav Richter, who was the Croatian architect that built the Brussels Expo Yugoslav Pavilion in 1958. Here's the model. And then Arne Jacobsen with the Danish designs, and Mies van der Rohe, of course, in Krefeld, just in the kind of late 20s. So the first NADA wanted to really look at this kind of first notion of how this project was developing. So as I said, this was this modernism as a tool used by Yugoslavia to kind of create its own aesthetic space that had to differentiate between all these kind of different world powers. Expo 58 is really, really fantastically important because it's the first world exposition where, after the Second World War, where countries have time to find money, politicians get involved to really, think about what they want to present to the world as their new post-catastrophic phase, which is, again, an interesting thing for us to be debating today within, our current crisis. Sorry to go back. So as you see, the central pillar, which is kind of the central thought of the architect, was censored. So this was what was the kind of the actual output. And what was really interesting is that, so I was kind of quite obsessed in going through all the transcripts to figure out why this was censored. And of course, there's, money issues as well. But I did find in the transcripts wording by the leading Yugoslav ideologue, who said, we can't go to Brussels with something that looks like a penis. So this symbolic castration of this core artistic thought, I thought was just fantastic ground to speak about, very universal thoughts that we have as culture producers. So what Richter did then is he reincorporated this kind of verticality into a sculpture in front of the pavilion, which was called Nada. So Nada was also a name of his wife, and she was an actress, and then gave up her work to follow, the husband in his world travels. But the Nada, this idea of this kind of Nada as this hope, as this kind of survival of this kind of artistic thought, away from this sort of state censorship, was kind of really, really interesting, I thought, and relevant. So what I wanted to do is recreate the model as it was intended, but do this play where the architecture itself becomes a musical instrument. So as the politicians were playing the architect, here a musician, an artist, plays the architecture itself. And she tunes it according to the tune of Bela Bartok's Miraculous Mandarin, which was a ballet composition that was chosen as a central artwork for the pavilion. So here's an archival image. This was a Belgrade production from 1957. And this is also really interesting because this was a ballet which was always marred by state censorship from its conception onwards. It premiered in Cologne Opera House in 1927, and it was banned on moral grounds because of the storyline. So the plot is it's a story of a prostitute that is used by these three pimps to lure wealthy clients. And I thought also this is a really great metaphor for the World Expo, where nation states go to this ground where they effectively prostitute themselves to gain international attention, and they kind of throw everything at it. So there's this kind of like storyline kind of relationship, but also there was just the relationship between the actual political styling. So also obviously the ballet was also banned on the grounds of its expressionistic character. So obviously this is the Belgrade production, not the Cologne one. The Cologne one was, of course, it's very, it's modernist music. It's, the set was very expressionistic. But what is quite interesting is that the mayor of Cologne was Konrad Adenauer, and he banned it on moral grounds. This was the official, storyline. And this was at the same time when Mies van der Rohe was building the villas Esters and Lange in Krefeld, which was 30 kilometers away from where this ballet premiered, where modernism was the thing to be doing. So that we always kind of have this whole thing that, it's the elite that needs to announce a new political language, a new political style, let's say, or new aesthetic language before the masses can follow. So it's a very interesting schism. What I did then with the ballet is I wanted to retrace its choreography. Of course, this was lost. There was no film recording. So for everything, we only had about, there was this one and another 12 photographs from rehearsals, but we really had a big lack in this choreography. So we reimagined it and repurposed it based on the paintings of the female body in sort of nation building or nationalist painting, let's say. Albeit we changed all these kind of very loaded symbols of flags, swords, and so on for geometric elements, which were parts of the scenography done by Dusan Ristic. And actually, this is a project I just now finally realized as an installation at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Lyon. It's on view until January next year. So I repurposed the ballet and I filmed it inside the Arne Jacobsen Town Hall in Aarhus. I was invited as an artist to do a project during the European City of Culture. So again, it felt like a really nice moment in time to do this. Because artists are always kind of invited to these European cities of culture to reignite somebody else's cultural capital. So it's very similar to what these expos were doing. And just a few install photos. So this was then the installation Baltic, and I always try to embed my films within larger installation projects. And just a note on this building. So Arne Jacobsen is an amazing, beautiful modernist masterpiece. And this is its basement. So of course I was not allowed to film in here, but just to kind of point to the schism of these governmental palaces and sort of celebrations of basically of high culture, they always have a basement. So this was effectively a mural, which was done during Nazi occupation. The problem is only that it has been restored and it's not problematized. So yeah, this is also what we kind of like try to kind of open up then in publications when we kind of get access and permission to publish things like this. The last chapter of Nada was filmed in the Mies van der Rohe's villas in Krefeld. So Mies, as I said, was the architect of the German pavilion in Barcelona in 28. And this is what this film was doing effectively. It kind of used German transcripts from German questioning of national representation from 3 world expositions. So on the top, this is the pavilion of Barcelona in 28. 29. Then you have here on the right, of course, you have Adolf Speer with the Nazi presentation in Paris, 42. And then you have on the bottom, you have Eiermann in Brussels in 58. So we see what Eiermann does. He effectively repeats Mies, right? So he kind of goes, we're not that Germany anymore, with this Germany, with a democratic Germany. Yeah, kind of picks up on the kind of, the continuation of the Weimar times through pure form. So again, I turned all this kind of patriarchal vertical language into three women, three allegories of an artist, a curator, and Germania, who are then positioned within the villas, debating, or like, let's say, just reenacting the words of the German politicians, where the only thing that changes is whether it's a figurative or an abstract representation. And the exhibition itself then happened also within the Kunstmuseum Krefeld, so in the house Lange and Esters, and kind of used the missing elements of the light box, the female nude, and the curtain as the kind of three main elements of the project. And what is essentially a research practice always comes together in a format of quite immersive Gesamtkunstwerke. So here's just a few shots from the installations, where all these kind of archives that I've been kind of unpacking come together in effectively theatrical compositions. And architecture is always kind of quite a central element, even when it kind of comes to the exhibition space. So it's really considered as this guiding mechanism for the spectators' behavioral patterns. So for example, this was an exhibition in Montreal where the space itself presented much more as a residential space. So what I did is I turned the project into collectibles. And the idea was that this was a fictitious house of a collector of dead nation states. So this is kind of the format that the practice has been sort of taking when the whole exhibition space is not necessarily a white cube or an airport. You know, it really still tries to take account of the specificity of the space. And just to conclude, just a few images of my last project I've been working on. So I've been until now really looking at the notion of commissioned culture, commissioned art and architecture. So I really wanted to look at also how much are we to blame? You know, what happens on the other end of the stick? So I wanted to look at the complicity of culture production. And so I started looking at this economy of gifting. So the notion of course, is this Marcel Mauss idea of, anthropologically what, the gift economy can present as a kind of counter narrative to the capitalist circulation. And of course, I do think it's a feminist discourse. You know, the idea of gifting is really, really interesting, I think, for culture, because a gift always needs a retribution gift. So if we consider culture being a gift, the counter gift is the social discourse it produces. So my whole kind of quest here was to bring together only political gifts of culture throughout biggest moments of European crisis of the 20th century. So they become locations, script, characters, and the storyline is pretty simple. The storyline follows three male allegories, which compete in a competition that is set to find the perfect gift to heal a divided nation. They are governed by four fundamental freedoms, these here, which I drafted as characters from a speech by Franklin Roosevelt, which he did to summon or to call upon America to join the Second World War. So these were freedoms from fear, want, worship, and speech. And these four women effectively are sort of these kind of organizers of a competition. And the three men are accompanied by sort of their little kind of attributes, if you want. So the artist's monologue is accompanied by a choreography by two dancers, as you see here. The diplomat is accompanied by music, because as much as I was going through all the transcripts, sort of the diplomatic solution to all kind of cultural gifting was always, let's give them a song. So this idea of music being the most benign was kind of quite seminal. And of course, then we have the engineer, who is sort of the architect who effectively builds the actual architecture that serves this undisclosed authority. What was quite amazing was, so this was a still from the Palace of Nations in Geneva. And this was a room which was a gift from Spain. And it's a room where the conference of nuclear disarmament happened. And it is incredible. It's like a James Bond villain layer, really. And it kind of really blew my mind to kind of think that, basically they were debating nuclear missiles in a space which is decorated like this. It's basically power verticals on steroids, So it really was kind of like this quest into the past, but it still is quite a contemporary discourse that kind of is present. So this is just from the UN Geneva Twitter feed, and you see the tapestry, which you also saw in one of the previous stills, which is in one of the kind of foyers in the building in the palace. So it's a tapestry which was a gift by Belgium in 1935, and of course this is not problematized, right? So you kind of have the 8 women representing, the different parts of the world. But of course, the exotic ones are naked, the European ones are clothed. And you kind of see the tweet, and it's not, again, it's not problematized. So it's like the basement in Argos, right? So effectively, the project kind of brought together loads of these archives that were never opened. So this was a selection of musical scores that were donated to the palace when it was shut. So the black humor of this building is that as soon as it's finished, so this was supposedly the parliament for the world, as soon as it's finished, the war that it was supposed to stop starts. So there were loads of these donations, loads of gifts by amateur artists and composers to the building. And just to finish here, these musical scores that were never enacted, I then kind of reused them as musical scores for new performative works that were presented within the film projections themselves. And of course, what now the palace is doing is they're not returning these gifts, they are not problematizing them, they're just waiting for the new political style to come and renovate them, because of course 1930s colonial Europe is fading away, it's leaking. UN Geneva has to change, carpets, so they are now allowing this to happen with Qatari and UAE new architecture. So it's like a new colonial political style. And of course, we have Russia. This is the Russian salon, which is actually quite a recent donation. It's a very kind of fast photo, as I was not really allowed to take lots of them. And you see on the ceiling, you have a Malevich, but on the walls, you have this, again, this what is kind of thought of the style of the elites. With its kind of very, very kitchen glamorous imagery. And of course, on the coffee table, you have a book from Chagall to Malevich and Fabergé's Animals. So just to kind of say that, there is a lot to still be said and debated, especially from the, people who are the actual cultural producers. And, questioning the client is really vital also for us, not just for the architects. So thank you very much. I'll try to come out of this. And again, I'm very sorry I am not there with you in person, but I am reachable on emails, and I'm very happy to answer any questions or also give you leads if you need to access any of the archives I have been mentioning. So we have the Spielraum book, we also have the NADA book on the NADA projects, and we're now working on 2 new publications, one on the gift and another one on another sort of set of sort of more sort of specific gifts based on the European identity. So I will say goodbye and have a wonderful symposium. Thank you.